Our gospel lesson today is the rest of the 18th chapter of Matthew. What we began last week will finish with Jesus teaching on forgiveness and a long parable that he tells about forgiveness. Matthew 18, beginning in verse 21. You can find that on page 985 in your pew Bible, should you care to look on. Listen for the word of the Lord. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay it back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. People talk about Jesus as a humble teacher, one who preached love and humility and caring for one another. If you read all that he said, though, you will run into sayings like this last verse of the chapter here. "This is how my heavenly Father will treat you." Sounds pretty terrifying. Not all the words of Jesus are humble and gentle and meant not to offend. These are some of the hard words of Jesus. And we'll talk about that. Jesus approaches it in 2 different ways. We get the harder way today. But first, let's have this conversation between Peter and Jesus. Because remember, at the very end of last week, in the middle of this chapter, Jesus was talking about what to do if somebody sins. Not necessarily against you, but there's somebody, a brother or sister in the church, who is sinning, doing something contrary to God's will, something to injure either themselves or other people, or both, and how it is that you deal with them. And now, Peter says, "Fine and dandy, Lord. I mean, yeah, we'll have people like that in our group." And as the church is formed, we didn't have a church yet. But Peter wants to know something more specific. What about those people who are always hurting me? What about those people who are insulting me or injuring me or offending me or hurting my feelings on all levels? The really serious level as well as that's just annoying and why is that person like that level? So Peter comes and he asks a practical question, but he also, and this is Peter's way, God bless Peter, we need Peter so badly, because Peter asks a question we all need to hear the answer to, but he also asks it in a way where he kind of catches it, because Peter is trying to present himself as somebody who is pretty much on the same page with Jesus, just want to make sure, and tries to appear magnanimous and gracious, and Jesus sees through him again. "Lord, how many times, when somebody sins against me, a brother or sister who sins against me, how many times shall I forgive them?" He thinks. 7 times, don't you think? Hoping Jesus will say, really, 2 or 3 is fine. 7 is a good biblical number, the days of creation. Some people say that in the Old Testament, you'll see 7 being the number of perfection. So he picks an important theological number, but he also thinks he's putting the line pretty far out there. Lord, don't you think after 6 times I ought to be able to say, we're getting pretty close to the end here? How many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 whole times? Do you think 7? I mean, I know that's a lot. But 7 times, don't you think? Because I could probably do 7. Jesus says, not even close. I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, let me just give you some quick advice. If you were thinking then what you need is one of those little bitty notebooks that you can stick in your pocket, have various people's names, and then start marking 1, 2, 3, 4, and the slash for 5, and all the way up. And when you get to 70, you know you're getting close, then you have missed what Jesus is trying to say. He is intentionally stretching it out beyond what you're going to be able to keep up with easily, beyond what it is that ought to be reasonable to expect of one another, at least from our point of view. Jesus says, I reasonably expect of you more than you think you can stand. And here's what I don't think I can stand. I'm going to have to give you the short version. These numbers are really important. And Jesus is taking something that is so familiar to Peter and the other disciples and bringing it in a way that's a complete twist. And someday we'll do a Bible study or something. I can do the whole thing. But let me remind you of a really bad guy in the Old Testament. Going back to Genesis 4, of course, we had Adam and Eve, and they had Cain and Abel, and Cain turned out not to be such a good guy, killed his brother Abel, and eventually Adam and Eve had another son, Seth, and then the line continued from there. And if you study Genesis much, you'll notice that the way that Genesis is told is you follow one line of the family for a while, and then you switch over to the other line. And just so you know, the good guys in the white hats are Seth's line, and the bad guys in the black hats are Cain's line. But in Genesis 4, we're sort of spinning off, after Cain has killed Abel, the various descendants of Cain. Really bad guy, first murderer in the Bible. And you get to this guy Lamech. And Lamech is a nasty figure. And we don't know very much about him except that he is prideful and arrogant and sets himself up to be even worse than Cain, the first murderer. He has more than one wife. And in these days, we think to ourselves, at the same time, in these days we think to ourselves, oh, that's how they did it then. But when you first heard Genesis 4 and Lamech said to his wives, and it names the wives, you're supposed to go, oh, gee, bad things are going to happen. You're not supposed to have more than one wife. Even though a lot of important figures in the Bible did, they were never supposed to. But Lamech says to his wives, hey, this young man injured me today, so I killed him. He hurt me in some way, and so I did not return eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Because he did something to me, I killed him. Because I escalate things. I take things to the extreme because I'm the biggest and baddest that there is. And he says if Cain was avenged 7 times, that's an important number, right? Then Lamech will be avenged 77 times. Now that's a story Peter and the other disciples would have known all their lives long about this really bad dude Lamech and how he set himself up as even being bigger and badder than Cain, the first murderer, and use these very numbers. Peter says, Jesus, up to 7 times should I forgive? And Jesus says, funny you should use that number 7. I remember another number 7 and 77 that came together. And if Lamech descends to the deepest depths, I am not just going to go eye for eye. I am going to end it all. I'm going to take it to its fullest extreme. And there's a science fiction story I should really bring in here about winning one battle in order to win all future battles. But we don't have time for that either. So someday, listen, we got lots to talk about. But the whole point is to take it to its furthest extreme, to the depths. I will avenge myself 77 times. Jesus takes it to the highest heights and says, 7 is hard, you're right, and you're not even coming close. 77 times, because avenging and vengeance and taking judgment into your own hands is not what you are to do. And isn't that what we do? If we decide 7 times I forgive somebody, by 5, we are keeping track. I'm getting close now. And you don't want to do this again. 6, one more time. And then I don't have to forgive you anymore. Then I can say, I am done with you. I am judging you, just like God would do, by the way. You've sinned against me in whatever way it may be. 7 times now you're done. Now I can treat you however I want. And Jesus says no. Because that's part of what happens. We're willing to forgive sometimes. But what we really want is not for the relationship to be made right. We don't want necessarily reconciliation. When somebody keeps stepping on our toes, and I'm using that to cover a whole load of offenses, when somebody keeps offending us, keeps hurting us in some certain ways, then we want to get them back, right? But we know we're supposed to forgive. But if I only have to forgive 7 times, then I can really lay into them on the 8th time. The necessary parenthesis, sidebar, tangent I have to go on is I ended up in a weird conversation, weird for me, not for the other person, probably in 2011, where I was talking about forgiveness and the fact that we are to forgive and to forgive and to forgive. And somebody said, well, yeah, this is their whole line of work, by the way. They were offended by this idea. But what do you mean by that? What about somebody who is in, for instance, a situation of domestic violence, which is all over the news now, right? Let me say, it's not what I mean, okay? I don't mean that you have to put yourself in danger and put up with. Forgiveness is a different thing and was seen differently even, 500 years ago by Calvin. I'm going to paraphrase here quickly, but Calvin was talking about when somebody does me harm, does me injury, and I go to this point of laying aside the desire for revenge, that's the beginning of forgiveness, and I do not cease to love this person, but even repay kindness in place of injury, though I entertain an unfavorable opinion of him, right? Because it's not that to forgive somebody means it never happened, you're as good a person as you could possibly be, and I'm going to walk right into this situation knowing that you will never hurt me again. But no, forgiveness is not exposing yourself to injury over and over again. Forgiveness is not staying in a situation that is dangerous or violent to you. Forgiveness is another matter. Forgiveness is, on the one hand, laying aside the desire for revenge. On the other hand, it is not wishing the very worst for that person, which we do, but rather wishing them well, even if that means that you put yourself in a position where you're no longer in danger. Lots to talk about there too, but that's for another time. But of course, I do not mean you stay with somebody who's beating you up. I do not mean that at all. God commands us to wish well of our enemies, but He does not demand that we approve in them what He also condemns. If sin is sin, then we do not say that's fine. That's why, by the way, when somebody apologizes to you, please don't say it's okay or it doesn't matter or no big deal if your feelings really were hurt or if you really were injured in some way. The proper response is, I forgive you, because it acknowledges harm was done, but also says, I don't want this harm to stay between us. It doesn't mean that you get to say, no big deal, because you're really not important enough to hurt me. It acknowledges I have been hurt, but I don't want us to go on this way. Not 7 times, 77 times, because it is more than you can reasonably keep track of, because Jesus basically means there is no limit, there is no end. We are called to forgive. Then He tells a story about this. When Jesus tells a parable, tells a story, we picture in our head what's going on. Please do that, by the way, with parables. I had a conversation after the first service because somebody very rightly, just very insightfully compared this parable to the log and the speck. Do you remember that, where Jesus says, we walk around with a log or a plank sticking out of our eye, and we're trying to mess with a tiny little speck of dust in somebody else's eye. And it's supposed to have a very vivid, cartoonish image of my coming at you to fix the speck in your eye. Meanwhile, I've got a plank of timber that's coming right at you, and as I'm swinging around looking for the speck, I'm going to take your head off. I had people down in North Carolina that had never thought through the implications. The log and the speck, that doesn't make sense to me. We put ourselves in the story. We almost always put ourselves in the wrong spot in the story. We pick a character and we identify with them and we look at what's going on from that perspective, and we're probably going to do it wrong here. But here's the thing. Kingdom of heaven is like. This is what it's like. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. Servants, not just slaves and not just lowly servants, but also court officials would be called servants in this time. And the first guy who shows up can't be like a farm worker. He has to be somebody relatively close to the king. And he began his settlements because a lot of people owed him money, and it was a lot of money in some cases. So he has the first guy brought in who's got to have the biggest debt of anybody that owes the king money. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000. I knew when we switched to this version of the Pew Bible, the 2011 version, that this was one of the things that was going to hang me up. Owed him 10,000 bags of gold. Because they don't want to burden you with the fact that the word is talents, and we don't use talents for a measure anymore. But I just want to say, neither do we use bags of gold as a measure. How many bags of gold do you, is it a little bag of gold or is it a big bag of gold? It's a lot of gold. So it's 10,000 talents, and that mattered then, even though if we don't know what that means now. But you've got good footnotes on that. 10,000 talents is roughly worth about 20 years of wages. It's probably more than that, actually. It's a huge amount. 10,000 bags of gold, 10,000 talents, is roughly 10 times the entire tax revenue for the country of Palestine at the time. So all the money they could possibly bring in, and you know they were corrupt and they were bringing in more than they should, all the money they brought in for taxes, times 10. Huge, huge amount of money. 10,000 bags of gold, 10,000 talents was brought. And since he was not able to pay, well, of course not. Small countries could not have paid this debt. Medium countries might not have been able to pay a debt of 10,000 talents. Of course he can't pay. So the king reasonably orders that he and his wife and his children and everything he has be sold to repay the debt. Will it cover the debt? Not even close. It won't cover the interest on the debt. But he's got to get something back, right? So he's going to sell everything, including the people in this family, to try to make back something, because he can't get any more than that. Servant hears this and falls on his knees and begs the king, "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I will pay back everything." Impossible. Be patient with me and I will learn how to jump from here to the moon. Just give me a little time and I'll figure it out. He can't possibly. He doesn't know enough people to borrow from. He doesn't know enough countries to borrow from. He could shake down everybody he's ever met. He cannot pay this debt. This is the most ridiculous statement you've heard in the Bible. Be patient and I'll pay every cent back. Can't be done. 10,000 talents will never happen. He could live for 1,000 years. He's not going to pay back this debt. Be patient. I'll pay it all back. And the master smiles, knowing he can't do it. And he cancels the debt and let him go. You're never going to be able to do this. We're even. Just go. 10,000 bags of gold. I'll pay it back, I'll pay it back. You can't pay it back. And at some point we can talk about what's he doing with 10,000 bags of gold being owed to this king. Why is the king owing him this much money? It's supposed to be blown up so extreme that you realize it's an incalculable amount of money, and it is an unattainable amount to repay. It is a debt beyond our imaginations. And the master said, it's canceled. It's done. We're even, and let him go. Then he goes out and he runs into somebody else lower on the totem pole than he is, another fellow servant, but probably not a high court official who could somehow borrow 10,000 bags of gold from the king. He runs into a fellow servant who owed him 100 silver coins. That's 100 denarii. A denarius is a day's wage. A lot of money. But you could pay back that. Several months of wages, given time, you could pay that money back. He has just had this gigantic, unimaginable debt paid, canceled, taken care of. He walks out, bumps into this guy. That's right, you owe me money. He grabs him and starts to choke him. And you are supposed to be outraged by this behavior. This should offend every moral sensibility that you have. You've been forgiven. Now you grab this guy, choke him, pay back what you owe me, he demanded. The fellow servant uses the same words. Be patient with me and I will pay it back. And he probably could. This is a debt he could probably make back at some point. But the first servant refuses, throws him in prison until he should pay back the debt. Except if he's in prison, how is he going to work to pay back the debt? He can't pay back the debt in prison. That's why that whole debtor's prison idea in England and other places, of course, didn't last a whole awfully long time, because once you're in prison, you can't pay back the debt. So what's the point of throwing debtors in prison? Because they can't make any money there. And then the other servants saw what had happened. They knew what had happened to the first guy, having this enormous debt canceled, and they saw that he choked this guy, demanded that he pay when he couldn't, threw him in prison, and they are outraged as they ought to be. And they go and they tell their master everything that had happened. Have you figured out which character we are in the story yet? See, probably, I'm guessing very few of you would pick the king, and that's good. That's the right thing. Few megalomaniacs may, have picked the king. You're not the king. You're really not the king. You might have been the guy who owed a lot of money, a whole lot of money, but probably not. You probably put yourself in the crowd, right? As you're watching this happen in your mind, all these things, you are probably with the other servants. And you cannot believe this guy. How could he have been forgiven this huge debt and now treat this other guy this way? And you are among the first to go and make sure you tell the king everything that happened. And that's not really where we're supposed to be in the story. But the master calls the servant in. You wicked servant. I canceled all that debt of yours just because you begged me to. Why didn't you have mercy on your fellow servant like I had on you? And then it takes an ugly turn. In anger, righteous anger, his master hands him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. Let's pretend for a second he was the guy with 100 denarii, 100 silver coins. I still don't see how being tortured is going to help him pay back the debt. He's probably never going to get out of prison. But remember, until he should pay back all he owes, a guy who owes the revenue of a small country, He's never going to pay it back. He's stuck there forever and ever. What on earth is going to come of this guy? And then Jesus says, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you, unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Many of us grew up with the image of the carrot and the stick. It's a choice, right? You want the carrot or do you want the stick? But in my mind, when I thought about the carrot and the stick, I only thought of the stick as something to hold the string from which dangled the carrot, and you put that in front of the animal, which presumably ate carrots, and then you convinced it to walk down the road. And so in my head, it's always a donkey. Donkey's following the carrot, and I'm holding this long stick with the string and out in front of it. And I never knew what you would do with the stick other than hold the carrot, which tells you something about my background, I'm sure. But what I didn't realize is that in the carrot-stick analogy, you can use the carrot to allure somebody in the right direction, or you can use the stick to beat them in the right direction that you want them to go. And this whole image got messed up in my mind from another series of books I read, which taught me something about the makeup and behavior of donkeys. I wasn't reading, well, I'm going to go there because I read things that you wouldn't believe that I read about donkeys and animals and other things. But I'm saying that I didn't read a book about donkeys, how are donkeys put together. I read stories about the fact that you can beat a donkey half to death. And if it doesn't want to go that way, it won't go. You can keep beating it, and it won't go if it doesn't want to. If the load you put on it is too heavy, it will lie down. And you can kill it before you can get it up again. So the carrot-stick analogy didn't mean as much to me because I didn't realize you can either lure it with a carrot or whack it with a stick. But this is the problem for us now. There's no carrot in this story, or not much of one. It's hard to find. This is the scary side of forgiveness. If you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart, this is how you will be dealt with. Jesus tells it in a nicer way in another place. What he says is, forgive your brother or sister so that you may be forgiven. Paul says the same thing. Jesus says, with the measure that you use, so it will be measured to you. This is a problem as well as a promise for us. The problem is that when it comes to our forgiveness, we want a great big scoop. Huge amounts of grace and mercy for me, if you please, Lord. But when somebody does us wrong and we are called to forgive, we want to take out the teaspoon and say, well, here's about as much grace as you deserve today, and that's about as much as I want to forgive you. And we forget that if we're going to use this tiny little measure, that's what's coming back to us. I could appeal to your moral sensibility and to your sense of what is highest and best. I could appeal to your ambition. I could appeal to a lot of things. But Jesus basically says, you don't want this. You don't want to be an unforgiving person. You want to be really, really, really forgiving because that's how you get forgiven yourselves. So as a survival strategy, let me recommend to you, be more forgiving than anybody you know. It's the best and safest way here. Here's the problem. We have somehow enabled ourselves to imagine that our slowness or unwillingness to forgive is somehow noble or somehow makes us a strong character, a strong person. That somehow there is something powerful about being unwilling to forgive or about holding a grudge or about keeping track of how many times somebody has wronged us. And we can wear that like a badge of honor, which is a horrible thing. And it's hard to even say that strongly enough because it's come so naturally to us. I'm not a pushover. I'm not going to be anyone's doormat. I'm not going to be walked over. And I don't forgive when people treat me this way. I was going to say, that's fine for people out there in the world. It's not fine for them. Actually, it's dangerous for them. It's really dangerous for a child of God. We don't have the luxury. We are called to forgive because we have been forgiven. We are called to be merciful because we have been shown mercy. We are called to love because we have been loved. Loved to death, by the way. I have been asked before, how far do I go? How much do I have to do? How much should I love? How much should I forgive? All that sort of thing. It is an impossible question for a pastor to answer. We would really rather you ask somebody else. Because I don't have a good answer for you. As far as I can see, there's not a point at which you can go, that's it and no more for you. Because I don't want God to say, that's it and no more for me. Dangerous thing. But please, please, don't think that in some way it is a badge of honor or a point of pride or somehow showing the strength of your character to decide, I'm not going to forgive people. For whatever reason you can come up with. No, I just don't do that. I don't forgive people. Well, okay, then I am in the position, I'm obligated to tell you, I'm not so sure about your forgiveness. Let's just take this back a step here. How is it that we think that we can be prideful about that? Lamech was prideful about that. Oh, you think Cain was bad? I'm a lot worse than Cain. Cain got avenged 7 times. I'll be avenged 77 times. The thing is, it's actually idolatrous, and you would never think that something like that would be idolatrous. Because what's the comparison between you and God that way? Now, you can decide that God is just so strong and so powerful that He can manage to forgive people, and it doesn't take much for Him, right? It doesn't hurt Him much. And so I can't really be like that. So it's okay for me to decide I'm going to hold this grudge, and I'm not going to forgive this person, whatever it may be. But it costs God a lot to forgive. The price of His own Son, His own blood shed, His body broken. It costs a lot for Him to forgive wrongs that are a lot more wrong than we know when we sin. We think most of our sins are kind of minor annoyances to God, unfortunate. Tiniest little sin is enough to send Jesus to the cross. The reason it's idolatrous is because we can say, okay, God can be forgiving, but I'm not going to be forgiving, and I'm a different sort of God than God is. You wouldn't say that out loud, but that's really what you're saying with your actions. If I'm not going to forgive anybody, anything, because I hold grudges, you're saying if I were in charge of the world, this is how I would do it, and I would be a wrathful God, the horrible gods of every sort of pagan mythology that you've ever read. No end, no limit. 77 times doesn't mean you need an app for your phone that will ding every time that somebody sins against you and you forgive them. It's supposed to be so far out there that you realize, I have to forgive, even when I don't want to. So what's your motivation? How do you manage somehow to forgive your brother or sister from your heart? Not putting yourself in danger, not exposing yourself to continued offenses, but rather to say, I am going to forgive this offense. I am going to wish you well and wish you better, by the way, because if you were a better person, you wouldn't have done this to me. So I want you to mature, and I want you to grow, and I want you to improve, and maybe not at my cost, not at my sacrifice, though I entertain an unfavorable opinion of him, said Calvin. I don't have to think you're awesome. I just have to think you're a child of God who needs forgiveness. How do we do that? Well, like I said, do it as a survival strategy, fine. I need to forgive so that I get forgiven. That's okay. But how about this instead? I'll forgive because I've been forgiven. Because in this story, the person Jesus wants you really to identify with, just for a second, you would never put yourself in this place. But we're all the guy with the 10,000 bags of gold that guy's calling in his debt right now, and we can't possibly pay. We're that person. Because the debt that we owe to God is so immense, we could never, ever pay it back. It is incalculable. It is beyond our means. It is beyond anything we could ever do. And to say, be patient and I will pay everything back is just as ludicrous with us as it was with the first servant. We can't. But we can do this. We can accept His offer to have the debt canceled. Jesus says, all that you owe, I will pay. In my body, with my blood, I will pay your debt. And we can say yes. And having a really good understanding of the fact that God doesn't forgive because it doesn't hurt Him to be sinned against. God doesn't forgive because He's so strong and powerful that it doesn't matter to Him. He is strong and powerful, more than you have any idea. But He forgives at a great cost. Therefore, let us be forgiving as well. Love in action. How will the world know that we're His disciples if we have love for one another? How do we live out that love? One of the ways is being willing to forgive. Forgiving and forgiving so that we may be forgiven. Showing God's love to others. As we have been forgiven, we forgive. As we've been shown mercy, we show mercy. As we've been loved, we love. Will you please join me in prayer? Well, Lord, that's a lot easier to say than to do. Without your grace, without your help, there is no possible way. Not only can we not pay our debt, but we cannot possibly forgive. We have trouble forgiving even the minor offenses, the little annoyances. It is certainly much harder to forgive the grave sins and injuries that we have suffered. But help us look to the cross, to our suffering Savior who did not remain on that cross, but died and rose again, conquering sin and death, all offenses and injuries, and granting us His Spirit so that we too can forgive as we have been forgiven.